Stephanie Williams, welcome.
Good morning, or as we say in Arabic, sabah al-khair. Good to see everyone here. I want to first thank Meghna and the organizers of this wonderful conference that has brought me to this gorgeous neck of the woods, and Kimberly, particularly, who I think has, really done extraordinary work in getting us all here and back to where we came from, and Bill Hall, who is my companion, my sponsor for the event. So, without ado, let's get started. This morning, I'm going to speak to you about three things. I'm going to start with a topic that is regional, and I've taken some liberties. The conference is really focused on the Middle East, which is the Sharq al-Awsat, the East. Sometimes we include Egypt in that. But I'm going to extend to North Africa, where I also spent some years of my career. And the first topic I'm going to talk about are the stateless peoples of the region. And I will start in the northeast with the Kurds in Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. I will move south to Kuwait, which actually has a stateless population. I'll touch briefly. I'll then go west and talk about Palestinians, who we heard a lot about yesterday. And then I'm going to move far west into North Africa to talk about a couple of marginalized and stateless populations, particularly on the southern borders of Libya and Algeria, but then also a group called the Amazigh, or the Berber people, who span really from Libya through Algeria to Morocco. And I know I'm leaving out other groups, but I'm really focusing on peoples who I came into contact in my career in the Foreign Service, where I spent 24 years, and then the 4 years that I spent in Libya with the United Nations. So the second issue I will talk about are peoples in the region who live in failed states. So these are peoples without a state. They're not stateless peoples, but they do live in states that don't function. We can talk about that. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about kind of what does this all mean for us as Americans, for American foreign policy, in light of some of, I think, devastating decisions that the Trump administration has taken with regard to, international assistance. Of course, I'll cycle back now and start with the stateless peoples. Hannah Arendt, I think, really defined what statelessness means. She was a stateless person herself. She was a refugee. And in some cases, these stateless populations are victims of geography. They literally were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Joshua's, I think, excellent presentation yesterday laid out the modern history of the Middle East and how the borders were drawn. So you have populations who just were literally on the wrong side of the border, or they're divided by geography or large swaths of desert when it comes to North Africa. It was Immanuel Kant, after all, who said that geography lies at the basis of history. So a lot of these peoples also were nomadic in the sense that they were just pulling up stakes and moving here and there. And, back before the borders meant anything, that was easy to do. And then the borders were drawn, and they were separated from their fellow tribesmen and families, and their traditional mobility was suddenly curtailed. So they became minorities in the successor states. And those boundaries negated what could possibly have been a more natural process for a similar group of people to cohere and identify as a distinct national entity. And then on the part of the new nations, they soon became powerful enough to prevent that integration, that coalescence of a national project for the subjugated minority group. So I'm going to begin our exploration by looking at the Kurds. And we talked a lot about the Kurds yesterday. I'm sure many of you, maybe your first knowledge was the terrible massacre in Halabja, 1988. Others may have come to know the Kurds through Operation Provide Comfort, which the US, after the first Gulf War, led this coalition to provide protection, humanitarian assistance, and a no-fly zone for the northern part of Iraq. And that's because Saddam Hussein was vengeful following that war. And he turned not only on the Kurds, but as we know, he turned on the Shia in the southern part of Iraq. So just to give you a sense of the scale of the Kurdish population, globally, it's estimated to be between 30 and 45 million people. So if you compare it to a nation, it would be the size of Poland or Uzbekistan. So the majority of the Kurds today live between Turkey, where they form about 25% of the population, Iraq, 20%, Iran, 10%, and Syria, 9%. So the dispersal has complicated their national project. I know it's definitely a cliche, but I think it can still be said that the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. For example, in Turkey, which now goes by the name Turkiya, but I will use the terminology Turkey, they've waged a long-running struggle, sometimes violently, with the government in Ankara over political recognition, cultural rights, and local governance. In Iraq, as I've noted, they were brutally targeted by Saddam. For a long while, though, because of Operation Provide Comfort, which had the no-fly zone, and then after 2003, when Iraq descended into violence and civil war, the Kurds in northern Iraq enjoyed a great deal of autonomy from the government in Baghdad. And we saw that really even up until the present time. In 2017, I was in Baghdad. I was the second in command at the US Embassy. This was all during the lead up to the liberation of Mosul from Daesh. After that, in the fall of 2017, the Iraqi Kurds decided to have a referendum, supposed to be a non-binding referendum, to ask the Kurdish population in Iraq if they favored independence, separation from Baghdad, from the country of Iraq. And it was like 92%. Not a surprise. Kurds were not really fond of the authorities in Baghdad. But after the liberation of Mosul, of course, Baghdad felt stronger, right? And they had neighbors, the Iranians and the Turks, who were not interested in a Kurdish independence status anywhere in northern, and especially in northern Iraq. So they were hit by economic sanctions, the Kurds were. The government in Baghdad moved militarily into the Kurdish region, taking a lot of land, and eventually the Kurdish authorities dropped their independence bid. In Iran, we heard a lot about Iran yesterday. The Kurds form a minority, and as we heard, they have been among the pillars of the opposition to the theocratic regime, and with terrible consequences for the Iranian Kurds. Now, the story of the Kurds in Syria, probably most of you learned about this group in northern Syria, particularly in northeastern Syria, in 2014, when the Daesh started moving in their waves across the Syria and into Iraq. And I was in Jordan at the time. And I was there when we made the decision. The US Special Forces advocated for a partnership with the Kurds in Syria. And they, they did amazing work with our forces. And we also saw in that pocket in Syria, a great deal of autonomy for the Kurds because the central government was in chaos. The country, Syria, was plunged into civil war. And it was really an astonishing experiment in self-rule for the Kurds in Syria, particularly as regards the empowerment of women. Well, as Josh also talked about yesterday, that all came to an end, pretty much, in recent days and recent weeks, when the new Syrian government, with the assistance of the Turkish government, and I would say a green light from Washington, defeated the Syrian Democratic Forces and brought those areas under the aegis of the central government. So, a very mixed bag for the Kurdish people. Periods of autonomy, but then the reassertion of central control. So, let's move on to the Bidoon. I'm wagering that not a lot of people have heard about this population. Bidoon in Arabic means without, and it means without nationality, literally. So, estimates vary in terms of the size of this population, but it's probably in the range of 100,000. Most of the Bidoon are descendants of nomadic tribes from across the Arabian Peninsula. And when Kuwait gained independence in 1961, they started to register nationals. About a third of the population was unable to register. A lot of it because they were on the move. They were in Saudi Arabia, they were moving to Iraq, but they really identified as Kuwaitis. But up until the 1980s, they basically enjoyed all the rights of Kuwaiti citizens. I remember being a consular officer in Kuwait, and they had laissez-passer, sort of travel documents, and we would just treat them like Kuwaitis, grant them, 10-year visas, because we knew that they were coming back, because they had all the services. But that came to an end. And the Kuwaiti government changed the status of the Bidoon to illegal residents. And so now they are without services, they live on the margins, and there are consequences in terms of radicalization. You just have to point to an individual like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind of 9/11, who was originally, the family was from Baluchistan, but they had sort of settled in this Bidoon population in Kuwait, and they were also on the margins, and I think you could say that perhaps contributed to his radicalization. So, that's the Bidoon. And now we'll move briefly to the Palestinians. We spent a lot of time on the Palestinians yesterday, but if you take the global population again, and Omar talked about the population within the occupied territories, Green Line, Israel, but the global population is about 15 million. 5.9 are registered as refugees, including the descendants of those displaced in 48 and 67. And those refugees live primarily in the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, where I served, Lebanon, and Syria. Jordan alone has more than 2 million registered Palestinian refugees, while Lebanon and Syria, respectively, have about 420,000. I would recommend, I saw it's up in the bookstore, there's a great book that was recently authored by Rob Malley and Hussein Agha. It's called Tomorrow is Yesterday. And it really walks you through the peace process, and I think is one of the most kind of candid analyses and from people who were deeply immersed in the process. Okay. So, I should move quickly. Okay, now we're in North Africa. These are the Tebu. The Tebu are a Saharan non-Arab population that they're on the southern borders of Libya with Chad and Niger. They were persecuted in Libya during the Gaddafi regime, particularly when he had his Arabization move or policy, but they identified with the revolutionaries in 2011, so their lot has improved a little bit. But there's a lot of tension between the Tebu and the Arab tribes who live in southern Libya. The Tuareg are a group, also a Saharan group, who border southern Libya, Algeria, Burkina Faso, all across what we would now call the Sahel and the Ku Belt. They were more identified with the Gaddafi regime, so they have really suffered since 2011, and a lot of them have been stripped of their rights and their nationality. They have a very strange administrative status in Libya, and where they reside is actually the home to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, human trafficking, arms trafficking, all kinds of trafficking. So they live in a great deal of insecurity. The last population I'll talk about are the Amazigh, or the Berber population. And they're related to the Tuareg. But they, across North Africa, have historically faced discrimination, including the banning of their language. In Libya, Gaddafi absolutely sought to crush the Amazigh identity. And now you can say the Amazigh are really the original inhabitants of this area. He told them, you can call yourselves whatever you want inside your homes, Berbers, children of Satan, whatever, but you are only Libyans when you leave your home. They form about 16% of the population in Libya. Their lot has also improved since the revolution. They are now allowed to teach their language in schools and to fly their flag, and that's the Amazigh flag, and to celebrate their new year. But because Libya still lacks a constitution, 15 years after the revolution, they have yet to see their rights formally enshrined. They have a much better situation in Morocco, by the way, where the constitution that was written in 2011 does enshrine rights for the Berber people. So now let me move quickly to the crisis of statelessness. And this is the failed states. And I lived and worked in two failed states, Iraq and Libya. And, I think, and I wrote a book about Libya, but I think this applies to Iraq as well. Those who, and for various reasons, the decision to engage militarily to topple these regimes failed to appreciate the degree in which the regime, the organs of the regimes, penetrated the state institutions. So once you rip out the regime, what do you have left? Nothing. I mean, when I went to Iraq in 2016, the health ministry was not delivering health services. They had torture chambers in the basement of the health ministry where they were torturing Iraqi civilians, and these were the Shia militias that really came to prominence. So in both countries, you also saw these sort of punitive campaigns against supporters of the regime, de-Baathification in Iraq, obviously the abolition of the military. In Libya, there was a very punitive political isolation law, which just instantly turned supporters, even very low-level supporters of the regime, into your enemies. And then, again, the armed militias that came to the fore, particularly in Libya. And we saw also the emergence of Daesh in both countries, also that necessitated the intervention of the United States militarily to rid these populations of ISIS. So there we are in Libya. We had state collapse, uncontrolled borders, violence, poverty, climate change. These all sort of combine, again, to render the stateless peoples that we talked about even more vulnerable in these environments. In Jordan, and here I'll talk about another sort of group of stateless, marginalized people, which of course are the millions of refugees that these conflicts have produced. I was in Jordan when the refugees from Syria started pouring across the border, 1.3 million at the height. And we still have, Jordan still hosts probably up to I don't know what the numbers are, possibly up to 1 million Syrians are still in Jordan because they don't have homes to go back to. It was a real sort of Herculean effort to work with. We worked very closely with the United Nations, both in Jordan and in Iraq, and frankly in Libya as well. When I was in the UN, I worked closely with the US government to provide humanitarian assistance. But in Libya, the uncontrolled borders just led to a huge pouring of people across the southern borders up to the Mediterranean. That's Jordan, that's Zaatari. And then this is really the scene almost every day off the coast of Libya, with these people being trafficked by these gangs, these mafiosos who put them in these boats. And then, something like, I think the numbers now are, since 2014, 28,000 migrants have drowned in the Mediterranean. Yeah, it's shocking numbers, right? And now I think as a result of the war in Sudan, we're going to see more people, but they're going to move up the eastern side of Libya and onto boats, probably heading, a lot of them are going to Greece now. So I'm going to quickly just wrap it up by saying, look, no surprise, the gutting of our soft power by the Trump administration and slashing of the funds for the international organizations, it's had a direct impact on these populations. And I think, it's just going to exacerbate what is already a horrible situation. In the first year since USAID was shuttered, more than 600,000 people have died after being cut off from assistance. And the projections are that if this continues, it could surge to 14 million by 2030. And a lot of that's going to come from Africa, which has the fastest growing population in the world. And, starvation, malnutrition, climate change is a lot of people are going to be on the move because they literally can't live in their countries. So, General Mattis used to say when he was the head of CENTCOM and he testified before Congress in 2013, he said, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. So again, that, minor, very small investment in soft power, I think, will do us a great deal of good as we look down the road to these crises which are still continuing. And I'll leave it there.
Okay, as you all know already, you can email to askaspeaker@gmail.com. We have here in Camden, we have our roving microphone wranglers. And if you're in our other remote locations and you want to ask a question, you write down your question and it'll be transferred through a vast series of tubes to us. I'm glad some of you recognize that reference. Okay, so I'll get us started. And I wanted to hear a little bit more, Stephanie, about stateless people within the failed states that you were talking about, because you just briefly began discussing them. Like, tell us more about what their plight is, and I presume for as long as the state remains failed, they are doubly trapped.
Right, so it's a double-edged sword, because in some cases when the central government just implodes, and you could see that in Libya and in Iraq, there's maybe some room for maneuver for these populations. But it's, there's no security, that's for sure. And particularly in Libya, where, the south of Libya, which is where all of the sort of stateless, marginalized populations live, and also in the, the western mountains where the Amazigh Berber live, there is no security. And so literally you have gangs, militias, armed groups, mafias, traffickers, Daesh, Al-Qaeda. So yes, the central government's not breathing down their necks, but there's just a lot of generalized insecurity and chaos. And then the whole complication of, the constitutional process, in a place like Libya, which really needs to be completed as part of a broader political negotiation, so that these groups, have their rights enshrined. that they can take, for some of them, like the Amazigh, and to an extent the Tebu. The Tuareg is a different story because of their association with Gaddafi, but that, you know, these groups can sort of, you know, finalize, cash in on the rights that they have acquired.
Okay, so let's stay with Libya a little bit more. I mean, as you said, it's still obviously highly unstable, to put it lightly. What ideally would be the next sort of critical steps to begin stabilization there?
So the ceasefire that I negotiated in 2020 is holding, knock on everything. There has not been nationwide. So that ceasefire was a nationwide agreement where, you know, Libya has had, well, if you count the revolution, it's had three civil wars, but it's had 2 civil wars since the revolution. So that has held, but there is localized violence, particularly in Tripoli. In the east of Libya, there's like a very strong man, kind of, you know, a general who brutally controls the eastern part of the country, eastern and a good deal of the south. But in the West, it's just much more chaotic. There are still, you know, armed groups. There's no monopoly on the use of force. This was another, I think, kind of, we didn't really think through the overthrow of Gaddafi because he opened his arsenal. And Libyans like guns generally. I think there's, you know, they have something in common with the United States, you know, and they don't like to give up their weapons. And, you know, if you've got a gun, no one's going to stop you from using it. You're going to use it. And so getting control of this, because there was really no military under Gaddafi. He had, you know, armed groups associated with his children. And so getting that process going, it has not happened yet. So I think that really needs to happen, and then politics will follow security.
Okay. Before I get to Mike too here, this conference it's my first time here, as you all know, and it's so remarkable insofar as our speakers have literally been in the room. They were critical players in the room and so many important moments in recent history. So do you mind if I ask, like, put us in the room next to you when you were negotiating that ceasefire? Because it's not often I get to sit next to someone and say, when I was negotiating a ceasefire. What was it like? Were there any moments, or pick a moment where you felt like everything was gonna fall apart? Who did you sit across the table from? What were their personalities like?
So we actually started negotiating with what was called the Joint Military Commission, composed of military officers, and that's a very loose term, from both sides of the conflict when the war was hot. And they wouldn't, you know, it was kind of like the Syrians. They wouldn't meet in the same room. They wouldn't stay in the same hotel. They would have, even though they knew each other very, very well. It was very tense, but we just gradually built on that. And then when there was a cessation of hostilities, which was also a result of massive external intervention in Libya, which, if anyone knew, I write about it in my book, but it's, that also helped, actually, to bring the hostilities to an end, because the Turks came in really big for the UN government against the Emiratis, the Russians, the Trump administration, first Trump administration. It was a really bizarre cast of characters on either side. But anyways, once the guns were silent, and we wanted to keep them silent through a formal arrangement, that's when we picked up the ball. And it was during COVID, so that actually helped. Because they started talking over Zoom or Microsoft Teams, and that they warmed up, and then we said, okay, let's have a kind of test meeting, which took place in Egypt, and then they said, okay, we're ready.
Who were the they?
The Libyans were ready. The members, the military officers were ready to sit down. And actually, one of the things I did was, for a day, we did this in Geneva, I left them to themselves in the room. Because they know each other. I mean, Libya is literally a 6 degrees of separation country. So they needed to work through stuff and not like perform for the mediator. So they did that, and they came out and they said, you know what, we're ready. And that was it. And I mean, we shaped it, but it's a sovereign decision. It's their decision. And you have to respect that and go at their speed, their tempo, not your tempo.
Did you, being a woman, have any impact or no impact on your effectiveness as a mediator?
I guess you'd have to ask them.
Okay.
I mean, then my Arabic was much better, so I spoke the language, and I sort of, understood I lived in the region, so I understood the cultural environment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when we go to our guests, our questions with the microphone, if you stand up, if you may, if you can, and remember to tell us your name and then what your question is. So we will start down here at microphone 2, please.
Sabah al-khair. My name is Hafsa. I'm from Morocco. I'm an exchange student at Oceanside High School in Rockland. My question for you is, do you see meaningful differences between stateless populations in North Africa versus the Levant, or are the structural causes largely the same? And what I mean by structural causes are the building systems and the historical factors in the region. Thank you.
That's a great question. Wow. Terrific, terrific. I think there are some particularities to particularly North Africa. The Amazigh or Berber population is an ancient people who, there are definitely ties. I saw there were ties across the Amazigh or Berber population between Libya and Morocco, but and this you could say is in common with some of the regimes in the East, the Middle East, is that they suffered due to this very strong centralized authority during Gaddafi and in your country up until, recent years with which was really, I think the 2011 process was also a function of the Arab Spring and the king's decision to craft a new constitution that was accepted. And then, sort of opened the aperture for the Berber population. I think that the stateless populations, and as I said, the Kurds, it's really a mixed bag. But I think they, Josh talked about the zero sum. They're on the side, the losing side of this sort of modern Middle East that we're contending with.
So we'll take a remote question, and then we're going to bounce kind of up and down. I think we'll go 3, 1, 4. Okay. So we have this question from Edie Prisant, and if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly, please forgive me. But as you can see, you mentioned the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. What about Israel's alliance with the Kurds?
So the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. It's just a generalized expression to say that, and you could see it very recently in Syria with the SDF, and this part is. We always knew that this partnership with, between the American Special Forces and the SDF was going to be very transactional. That doesn't mean that it's, the way that it ended and the situation that they now find themselves in is not just sort of horrible. And so again, the Kurds in Iraq provided protection, but when they want to take the next step. So I think what you're referring to is probably the Israeli relations with the Kurds in northern Iraq, which is, I think it's just a fact of life. But I think the Kurds have had friends, lots of different friends at different points in time. But, again, they've mostly been on the losing end of the equation.
Go up here. Was microphone 3? Is that right? Okay. Go ahead.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Chris Armstrong from Brewer High School. I understand that you've already mentioned ceasefires in relation to this, but what would some of the ideal outcomes be for these stateless people? Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, I think basic outcomes would be just recognition of their rights. If they, if they have a particular language that's recognized by the state, it's codified in constitutional arrangements which provide, further protection against a capricious government, that they have, cultural rights, education rights, and to the degree, and it depends on the population, a sense of autonomy. But I think that the direction, the history, and I think the future of the region, particularly with the introduction of all the surveillance technology now, is going to, further entrench centralization, which will come at a cost for all of these populations.
Back down here to microphone 1.
Hi, Gamble Rastampur. I'm Kurd, grew up in Iran. And as you know, as an expertise, so if you go back to 7 centuries, a long, long time ago, we had, before even Persian Empire, before Ottoman Empire, Kurdishism was huge, and we had our own empire and self-ruled government. So I'm just wondering about the stateless terminology. Stateless terminology doesn't work for 45 million people, a nation. It means they had a land. It means they had territory. It means they practiced their democracy, and they were there. So just I'm asking you about the stateless. Anyone asked this question before? Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No, I think that's a great point, because of course, you can refer back to history when there was more cohesion for this ethnic group. But I'm really referring to the modern definition of statelessness, and this clearly desire by Kurds, or many of them, to regain their historic place, and to come together as a people. So I agree, it's open to interpretation. That's sort of the framing that I chose to take.
Can I just ask you something, a follow-up on that? Because thinking of what Joshua talked about regarding the real modern change. Actually, this was a recurring theme throughout Friday and yesterday in the world, but was the formation of the nation state, right? But we as human beings never really let go of, for reasons both good and bad, religious and ethnic identities as the previous way to define, to put borders, whether those borders were fungible, between groups, right? And so that does seem to be particularly almost an endless conflict point, especially in this region. Yes. Have you experienced or seen any potential ideas or breakthroughs that somehow sort of brought those two realities together in a nation state where ethnic states were still identified and protected?
I think that probably the best example is Morocco, the Kingdom of Morocco, and the constitution that was crafted in 2011, which did grant actual rights, enshrined rights for a very large portion of the population, who did feel very. I remember I visited Morocco in 2007, and I met with Berber Amazigh political activists who were afraid to speak their language around me. They didn't know who was at the next coffee table listening in. So that's totally changed. So it can happen, but that's sometimes it has to be an actual challenge to the leadership, and that forces them to not only, acknowledge minority rights, but more broadly, protections for the population.
You said you visited in 2007?
2007, 2006, something like that.
So that's a rapid change then.
It's very well. I think it was a function of the Arab Spring as well.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of these governments came under pressure. Some responded better than others.
Okay. Microphone 4, please.
Hi, my name is Brendan Edwards, and I'm from Edward Little. How might a U.S. attack on Iran impact people without a state in Iran or surrounding states?
That's the big question, is it? Have we learned anything? Because God forbid, we talked about sort of the refugees who, in the 2010s, moved all the way from Afghanistan they crossed Iran, Iraq, and, Turkey and into Europe, which had a huge effect on politics in Europe, where I live now. Right, 85 million Iranians. If Iran implodes, which is highly likely if there's, external military intervention, I think this is going to have knock-on effects all across the region, economically, socially, politically, security. So hopefully we've learned some lessons, but I don't think so.
The shorthand answer would be it could go from bad to worse.
Yeah, I don't see a scenario where this, that's, someone talked about magical thinking yesterday. That's magical thinking.
Yeah. Okay, we have time for one more here at mic 2, please.
I'm Joe Gutentag. I have a home in South Bristol. To what extent are these homelessness problems caused by the creation of countries by the colonizers from Europe and by the U.S. and, for example, in Liberia? Are they caused by the creation of countries in Africa with artificial borders which gave no reference to the people who actually lived there?
So I think yes. I'll stick to Africa and the Sahel region because, that's definitely the situation for the nomadic Tebu and Tuareg populations who are literally these, Libya was a state that was created in 1951. It's always had a sort of sometimes violent border conflict or issue with Chad. And these are people who straddle the Chadian and Libyan border. So yes, so when lines are drawn in colonial capitals, these people are oftentimes the first victims of those decisions. And then more broadly, in sub-Saharan Africa now, because of conflict in places like Sudan, the Great Lakes, but also, this whole belt now on the Sahel, which all of these nations have undergone military coups that are inherently destabilizing, not to mention the presence of Russian mercenaries who are plundering and running with the various warlords their own trafficking operations. All of this is inherently destabilizing, and we've seen, Daesh, Al-Qaeda attacks, which then force people on the move. And then you have just, climate change, which is really affecting sub-Saharan Africa and making these places unlivable, and then deteriorating health standards, a lot of that due to this, cutting of U.S. assistance to this region. So, well, sorry, I don't have sorry, there's not a happy ending.
Well, as Bernard said yesterday, to be sort of realist means to be at least a little bit cynical. So, but that is the history that you just laid out. So, thank you so very much.
Thank you, Meghna.